Almost 3 years ago now, I had an experience that changed my life and the way that I view the world. Specifically, it showed me how fragile democracy is because I had front row seats to one that was failing. In 2022, I spent 2 months living in Tunisia as a trainer with Journalists for Human Rights. That means that over those 2 months, I traveled around the country, I worked in newsrooms there, met with journalists. I even interviewed a former cabinet minister. And I also lived a life there. I had friends, I went to the movies, I went shopping, went to cafes, and I got a tattoo there. But these were the kinds of stories that were being written about Tunisia less than a year after I left. And this is a little over 2 years later. This is also a more recent article. Now, Tunisia is an incredibly special place. It's actually where the Arab Spring first began, if you're familiar with that. A Tunisian fruit seller in an incredible act of protest self-immolated, and this sparked a revolution. And ultimately, Tunisia and several other countries became democracies. And while many of the other countries eventually backslid, Tunisia was touted as the success story of the Arab Spring. Now, I lived in Tunisia in a very consequential time. 1 month after I left, Tunisia had a referendum about opening up the constitution that they settled on in 2014 when they became a democracy. I heard mixed opinions from the people I spoke to about whether to open the constitution, whether they trusted this president to do so, and whether they thought that he would use this as an opportunity to increase democracy or move away from it. But I also heard folks say that they don't really care about the constitution or anything that high level. They cared about whether they could afford to put bread on their table. And in that moment, a lot of people were struggling. Sound familiar? After I left the country, the referendum happened and it was marked by incredibly low voter turnout and an incredibly high approval rate. And ultimately, it really expanded the president's powers. This was a president who had a populist bent and who had scapegoated migrants. And ultimately, as an expert in constitutional law, won the presidency by a landslide in 2019. He campaigned that the democratic system was not working because the political parties in parliament had too much power. And here is how that turned out. And since that referendum, this shifted from a question to an answer. At the end of last year, Kais Saied, the Tunisian president who had done all of that, won his second term in a landslide. A landslide where only 2 candidates out of more than a dozen hopefuls were allowed to stand against him, where only 29% of the more than 9 million registered voters took part, and his closest challenger won 7% of the vote, despite being sentenced to 12 years in prison. So now that you understand what happened to Tunisia's democracy, I want to tell you about the signs that I saw when I lived there. Because this is the part of my experience that keeps me up at night. It's that almost everything felt normal. 1 minute you're talking about politics, and then the next you're deciding whether you want mint tea or a Turkish coffee, and you're talking about nonsense with your friends. You know, 1 second you're at the sale rack in Zara, and then you check your phone and you see a headline like this. And you're like, oh, the president just fired 57 judges? That doesn't seem good. But what can you do in that moment? And so you go and you see Jurassic Park in the movie theaters with your friends. You choose what toppings you want on your popcorn. A failing democracy feels like being a crab in slowly boiling water. I think for those of us who have lived in incredibly stable democracies our whole lives, it becomes really easy to think that the failure of democracy would be this huge crash bang explosion where there'd be one really big clear moment. But that is not how it happens. And that is especially not how it happens if you have privilege in a society. I lived in a good neighborhood. I could always afford food. I could always afford clothes. I could afford to go out and have fun with friends. The canaries in the coal mine for a failing democracy are a society's most vulnerable members. If people who are low income or are members of vulnerable groups are sounding the alarm, you should listen. Because what happened in Tunisia genuinely breaks my heart. And I have so much hope that the incredible, badass, brave, tough journalists and just normal people who I met there will get back to a place where their society treats them fairly and hears their voices equally. And while I know this isn't a perfect parallel, there are too many similarities for me to ignore. Because democracy isn't something you have, it's something you do. And I really think that a lot of people don't understand just how fragile it is. You might think it. You might think that you understand how fragile it is, but until you've lived it, it is really hard to understand the degree to which you don't understand how fragile it is. So please pay attention to what's happening around you. More than anything, listen to your most vulnerable community members and understand that it could absolutely happen where you live. I've tried to tell this story on here before, and I've just found that it never really hits, just people don't seem to hear it. And I just hope that this time people listen, because it is so important. As always, what do you think of all this?